So after studying this module, you shall be able to know about the location and general functions of different lobes of the cortex, learn about the functions of temporal lobe in more detail, identify various areas of temporal lobes and their functions, and learn about the temporal lobes and dysfunctions and syndromes. Let me first introduce you to the topic. The human nervous system comprises a network of cells that help in carrying information from all parts of the body. One of its divisions is the central nervous system. The other, being peripheral nervous system, comprises the brain and the spinal cord. These two components of the nervous system controls the life sustaining functions of the body, thought and other cognitive processes, emotions and behaviors. The human brain is larger than any of other primate. When corrected for body size, it is more than 3 times larger than that of a chimpanzee. Although the brain is exceedingly complicated, an understanding of the basic features of the brain development makes it easier to learn the location of the most important structures. The brain development begins with a thin tube and ends in the structure weighing approximately 1400 grams and consists of several hundreds of billions of cells. The brain is a large mass of neurons, glia and other supporting cells. It is the most protected organ of the body, which is encased in a very tough bony skull and is floating in a pool of cerebrospinal fluid. The brain receives a copious supply of blood and is chemically guarded by the blood-brain carrier. There are 3 major divisions of the brain, organized around the 3 chambers of the tube that develops in the early embryonic life, that is the forebrain, the midbrain and the hindbrain. The forebrain structures include the cerebral cortex, which is divided into 4 lobes or areas to execute specific functions. The brain is the most important component of the nervous system, and it is the part that takes the information received from the senses, makes sense of this information, makes decisions using it, and sends commands to the muscles and the rest of the body to execute innumerable daily life functions. Let us now understand the 4 major lobes of the cerebral cortex. The cortex or the rind or the outer brain covering is the outermost part of the brain. It is made up of tightly packed neurons and actually is only about 1/10 of an inch thick on average. The tissue of the cortex appears greyish pink because of the neural bodies, which are grey, and the small blood vessels, which are pink in color. The cortex is very recognizable because it is full of wrinkles and it is part of the brain most people visualize when they think of what brain looks like. The convolutions, the wrinkles consisting of sulci, that is the small grooves, and fissures, that is the large grooves, and gyri, these are the bulges adjacent to the sulci or the fissures, greatly enlarge the surface area of the cortex compared with the smooth brain of the same size. As a matter of fact, 2/3 of the surface of the cortex is hidden in the grooves. The total surface area of the brain is of about 2.5 square feet and the thickness is around 3 mm. The cortex is wrinkled because it allows a much larger area of cortical cells to exist in the small space inside the skull. Since the brain develops before birth, it serves as a covering of other brain structures. The cortex gets more and more wrinkled as the brain size increases and complexity increases. This increase in wrinkling is called as corticalization and is a real measure of human intelligence. The cortex is divided into 2 sections called cerebral hemispheres, which are connected by a thick tough band of neural bodies called the corpus callosum, that is meaning hard bodies. Each cerebral hemisphere can be further divided into 4 sections by looking at the deeper wrinkles or fissures in its surface. These 4 sections are called as the lobes or cortical areas of the brain. The lobes are occipital lobe, parietal lobe, frontal lobe and temporal lobe. Each of the 2 hemispheres of the brain contains all the 4 lobes of the brain. The brain is divided into 2 hemispheres due to the deep fissure called the longitudinal fissure. The central ring of the interconnected neurons, which touches almost all areas of the lobes in both hemispheres, constitutes the limbic system, which controls emotions and motivational processes in organisms. Let us now study the first lobe, that is the occipital lobe. At the base of the cortex towards the back of the brain is the area known as the occipital lobe. The word occipital means rear of the head. This area processes visual information from the eyes in the primary visual cortex. The latter is located on the upper and the lower banks of the calcarine fissure. Calcarine means spur-shaped. The visual association cortex is the part of the brain that helps identify and make senses of the visual information from the eyes. Each area of the cortex has association areas that help people make sense of the sensory information. Thus, primary areas in each lobe perform the sensory functions, whereas the association areas perform perceptual functions. Second is the parietal lobe. The parietal means wall. Parietal lobes are at the top and at the back of the brain. Just under the parietal bone is the skull. This area processes information from the skin and the internal body receptors for touch, taste, temperature and body position. This area comprises of somatosensory cortex, an area of the neurons running down the front of the parietal lobes on either side of the brain. It is also comprised of the areas for kinesthetic sensation and visuospatial orientation. Next comes the frontal lobe. Frontal lobes are situated in the front of the brain, hence the name frontal lobe. This part performs all higher functions, that is the cognitive functions of memory storage, planning, decision making, etc. The frontal lobe also helps in controlling emotions by means of its connections to the limbic system. People with damage to this area may also experience problems with performing mental tasks, getting stuck on one step or one wrong answer and repeating it over and over again. The frontal lobes constitute motor cortex, which controls the movements of the body's voluntary muscles by sending commands out to the somatic division of the peripheral nervous system. Next comes the temporal lobe. The temporal lobes are found just behind the temples of the head. The temporal lobes comes from base of the brain, ventral to the frontal and the parietal lobe. These lobes contain the primary auditory cortex, which receives auditory information and which is located on the upper surface of the deep fissure on the side of the brain called the lateral fissure and the auditory association areas. If a person receives a blow to the side of the head, he will probably hear a ringing sound. Also found in the left temporal lobe is an area that is in most people that is particularly involved with language. It is called as the Wernicke's language area. Now let us understand what is called as the Brodmann's area. Studies done by Brodmann in the early part of the 20th century generated a map of the cortex covering the lobes of each hemisphere. These studies involved electrical probing of the cortices of epileptic patients during surgery. Brodmann numbered the areas that he studied in each lobe and recorded the psychological and the behavioral events that accompanied their stimulation. Major Brodmann areas in each lobes are described. The parietal lobes are comprised of areas that play a role in somatosensory processes. They include areas numbered as 3, 2 and 1 in the diagram, which shows somesthetic areas, primary sensory areas for touch. Areas 5, 7 and 40 are somatosensory areas, presensory association areas, and area 39 is the angular gyrus. The occipital lobe contains areas that process visual stimuli. Area numbered as 17 is the primary visual area. Areas 18 and 19 are the secondary visual association areas where visual processing occurs. The temporal lobes are comprised of the areas that are involved in processing of auditory information and semantics as well as the appreciation of smell. Area numbered as 41 is Heschel's gyrus, the primary auditory area. Area numbered as 42, immediately inferior to area 41, is also involved in the detection and recognition of speech. The processing done in this area of the cortex provides a more detailed analysis than that done in area number 41. Areas 21 and 22 are the auditory association areas. Both areas are divided into two parts. One half of each area lies on either side of area number 42. Collectively, they can be called as Wernicke's area. Area numbered as 37 is found on the posterior inferior part of the temporal lobe. Lesions here can cause anomia. Let us now see what are the major areas of the temporal lobe. The temporal lobes are important structures for a number of functions. The first area we discuss is the Wernicke's area. There is an area particularly more active in the left temporal lobe called as the Wernicke's area. It is named after the physiologist Carl Wernicke, who first studied problems arising from damage in this location. This part of the brain seems to be involved in understanding the meaning of words. Wernicke's aphasia is a condition which is a result of the damage to this area that causes the affected person to be unable to understand or produce meaningful language. The person would be able to speak fluently or pronounce words correctly, but the words would be the wrong ones entirely. He will not comprehend the words spoken by another person. For example, Elsie suffered a stroke to the temporal lobe, damaging the Wernicke's area of the brain. In the emergency room, the nurse tried to take her blood pressure, and when the cuff inflated, Elsie said, "Oh, that's so Saturday hard." Elsie thought she was making sense, but neither the nurse nor Elsie's daughter could understand the meaning of the statement. Let us now study the second area, which is the hippocampus. The hippocampus is located within the temporal lobes on each side of the brain. An electrical stimulation of the temporal lobe may produce memory-like or dream-like experiences. Hippocampus is a Greek word for seahorse, and it was given to this structure because first scientists who discovered it thought it looked like a seahorse. The fornix or arch is a bundle of axons that connects the hippocampus with other regions of the brain, including the mammillary bodies. The latter are protrusions on the base of the brain that contains part of the hippocampus. Researchers have found that hippocampus is responsible for the formation of long-term permanent memories that are stored elsewhere in the brain. The neurotransmitter acetylcholine is involved in the muscle control and the memory functions of the hippocampus. The hippocampus may be located close to the area where memories for location of objects are stored. It has been found that the right parahippocampal gyrus located to the right of hippocampus is more active when the person is planning a travel route. This might also explain why older people tend to forget where they live or have similar other location problems, since their neurons begin to slow down or decay due to age. It may lead to the deterioration of the functioning of hippocampus. People who have Alzheimer's disease have much lower levels of acetylcholine in this region in comparison to normal people and show severe deficits. Let's now study the third area, which is amygdala. The amygdala, which means almond shape, is an area of the brain located near the hippocampus. Both of these areas seem to be responsible for fear responses and the memory of fear. Researchers have found that monkeys with large amounts of their temporal lobes removed, including amygdala, were found completely unafraid of snakes and humans in such fear-provoking stimuli. This came to be known as the Clover-Bussy syndrome. Rats that have damaged amygdala also show no fear when placed next to a cat. What is interesting in the functioning of amygdala is that the information from the senses reaches amygdala even before it reaches upper parts of the brain, so that people can respond to danger quickly, sometimes even before they are consciously aware of what is happening. Now let us come to the understanding of what are the temporal lobes dysfunction and syndromes. In a nutshell, besides auditory sensation and auditory perception, temporal lobes serve many more functions like those of memory and learning. It receives auditory messages and some visual information and contributes to the understanding of spoken language and rhythm. Moreover, it controls how things are categorized and ordered by an individual. There are many problems associated with malfunctioning of the temporal lobe, like aphasia, short-term memory loss, inability to categorize objects, increased aggressive behavior, etc. The major abnormalities associated with temporal lobes are as follows. First is prosopagnosia. Prosopagnosia is a neurological disorder which is characterized by an individual's ability to recognize faces. Prosopagnosia is thought to be the result of abnormalities, damage or impairment in the right fusiform gyrus, a fold in the brain that appears to coordinate the neural systems that control facial perception and memory. Prosopagnosia can result from stroke, traumatic brain injury or certain neurodegenerative diseases. Next is the Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's aphasia is characterized by difficulty in understanding spoken words. People with this abnormality tend to speak fluently, but their speech often becomes random, very hard to follow. Streams of unconsciousness constituting made-up words and is usually associated with lesions to the Wernicke's area, a piece of the cortical tissue at the boundary between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. Next comes the disturbance of selection of visual and auditory input. Impairment in selection of auditory input is determined through dichotic listening. Ordinarily, normal subjects report more of the words presented in their right ear. However, left ear advantage is maintained in people with left temporal lobe lesions. In case of visual input, damage to the left temporal lobe results in impairment of the recall of the content in the right visual field. However, damage to the right temporal lobe results in impairment in recall of content from both the fields. Next comes the organization and categorization of information. Patients with temporal lobe abnormality have difficulty in placing words or pictures into discrete categories. Patients with temporal lobe lesions may demonstrate dysphasic symptoms, wherein they can work through broader classifications but have difficulty with the specific categorization process. Next comes memory. In 1950s, research including removal of medial temporal lobes, amygdala and hippocampus demonstrated instances of amnesia for all the events after the surgery, referred to as anterograde amnesia. Also, the damage to the inferior temporal lobe results in the interference of conscious recall of information that may be relevant to the individual. Let us now study the differences caused in the personality. Pincus and Tucker described several symptoms associated with the temporal lobe epilepsy, which were reflected in the personality traits like egocentricity, paranoia, preoccupation with religion, and proneness to aggressive outbursts. A summary of the functions and dysfunction is as follows. The functions are: memory and new learning, controls how things are ordered and categorized, receives auditory messages, some visual perception, understands spoken language and rhythm. The dysfunctions associated with temporal lobe are prosopagnosia, that is difficulty in recognizing faces, Wernicke's aphasia, that is difficulty in understanding spoken words, short-term memory loss, disturbance with selective attention to what we see and hear, difficulty with identification and verbalization about objects, interference with long-term memory loss, and increased or decreased interest in sexual behavior, increased aggressive behavior, inability to categorize objects, and persistent talking, that is right lobe is damaged. Well students, now let us summarize what all we have learnt in this chapter. First of all, that each of the two brain hemispheres can be further divided into 4 areas or lobes due to the deeper wrinkles or fissures in its surface. Temporal lobe contains the primary auditory cortex and auditory association areas. Functionally, temporal lobes are divided into several Brodmann areas. Temporal lobes include important structures like Wernicke's areas, hippocampus and amygdala. Temporal lobes serve many functions like those of memory and learning. The malfunctioning or damage to the temporal lobe cause disorders like prosopagnosia, Wernicke's aphasia, short-term memory loss, inability to categorize and verbalize objects, and increased aggressive behaviors.